In this lesson, we're going to learn more about stationary and movable lights. All right, so we've gotten a little bit of an introduction to the mobility modes of a light, and we really want to talk about stationary and movable lights. So a static light, like we said, is baked into a light map and then it's forgotten about. It's no longer calculated during runtime. Now, the downside to static lights is that they cannot be changed in any way during runtime. Now, we may want to change something about a light. Let's say we want to change its color information or its intensity. We can do that through blueprints, but only if it's a stationary light or a movable light. So if you want to create a light that is turned on or off, you would want to use one of those two. Now, stationary is going to be a mix between static and movable. We'll be able to use or change the intensity or the color or any of the properties of the light, but we won't be able to change its position or rotation. Okay? Whereas movable will give us full control like that. Now, the way to show how a stationary light is going to work the best is by creating some dynamic objects and putting those into the scene. So, for example, what I want to do is I want to take this rock. Actually, let's take this rock right here. I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to create a copy of it, drag that up, and I'm also going to change its material. It has this snow material where snow is on top of it. I'm going to go ahead and search for that material, and I'm going to choose this cave rock, and we'll just assign that to that. Okay, and then we're going to drag this up to the ceiling. Okay. And this rock, I also want to make sure that I change some values about it. I want it to be dynamic. And so to make a static mesh dynamic, you'll scroll down, you go to physics. So you want to tell it to simulate physics, and then you'll also want to make sure that it has collisions on top of that. So to do that, you will double click on the static mesh in your properties. So right here, double click on that, it's going to bring it up. And then I'm going to go to my collision, and I'm just going to use this 6 DOP simplified collision. You could use 10 if you want to give it a little bit of a closer read on its collision, whatever you want to do. But I'm just going to go ahead and use the 6 DOP simplified. So there's that. And once that has been set, I'm going to go ahead and save that on my object, and I'll close that. And then from here, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and make a couple more copies of this. So I want, like, let's say 4 of these into the scene. And all these are going to fall at the same time. So they're all dynamic, and they'll all fall. And they'll also fall through our light, which we have right here. Now, we've already set that to static, but in this lesson, we've switched over to stationary. And we're going to see exactly what that does here. So notice, once we have switched it over to stationary, by doing so, what that's going to do for us is it's going to tell us that we need to rebuild the lights. So a stationary light still has some properties of that static light. It's going to bake light into a light map, okay, and it needs to bake that light into these objects as well. Now, because these are mobile, they won't be baking light on those. So with this, let's go ahead and just say build lighting. Let me move this over here. So I'm going to click on this, say build lighting only. It's going to build that. Let's give it just a moment to do so. Now, once that has finished building that lighting, what we're going to do is we're going to go up here. We're going to say simulate, because I just want to stay right here in this position, and watch those rocks fall. So as they fall, you'll notice that they have some shading properties to them. They're shading underneath. They were shading on the walls. Let's go ahead and stop that simulation. You may spread those out a little bit more so that way they don't go flying. They were interpenetrating with some objects already, so we don't want that. So I'll just kind of have them fall from here. And let's just do simulate. And those will fall. Notice the shadowing along the top. Let me show you one more time. Simulate. Notice the shadows, and that's being emitted from that light source. Those would not emit shadows if this was static. So if we switch that back, we rebuild the lights. Give that just a moment. And once that's finished, let's hit simulate again. Notice no shadows being emitted on the top. Now there was a shadow right here, but remember that's from our directional light. We'll stop, simulate again, no shadows on those surfaces. So those are some things to think about. Now, let's take a look at our final mobility type, and that is movable. So with that light selected, let's switch that over to movable. And what this allows us to do is to have full control over the light. We can change any of the properties. We can move it, we can rotate it, we can scale it, whatever. We can do anything. It's fully dynamic. Now, the problem with that is that the lighting information cannot be baked in. It's not going to take this into account. So what we see is what we get here. And also, it's not going to create the indirect illumination shadows. So we're not going to get that nice shading underneath some of the objects. So what we see in the scene is what we get. We notice we don't have to rebuild lighting. And if I come in and I hit simulate, you'll notice those shadows appear on the cave walls. And if we take a look at this, okay, you'll see some shadows underneath, but we're not going to get any indirect illumination, okay, from that. So you can see that the light is not bouncing and up onto that surface there, okay. So here you can see exactly how stationary lights and dynamic lights are going to work with other dynamic objects in the scene. So I should say stationary movable lights. I keep saying dynamic. So with that, we know how to use mobility. It's now up to you to figure out what is going to be best for your project. Is it an area that you need to see the shadows and the lighting emitted on a dynamic object? So if it's something like a character running through the level and you want the character to cast shadows onto the wall, are you going to use a static light? No, you're going to use a stationary light or a dynamic light. Okay, so remember the expenses that you have on top of those, static being the least expensive, and then the movable being the most expensive. Okay, stationary is going to give you a good mix between the two. So it's up to you on how to discern on what you want to use for either one of those. So now that we've talked about those lighting properties, let's take this level, let's add some more lights into it, and let's start talking about what it's like whenever we start getting more complex scenes with different lights and what to watch out for, and we'll finish this level off. So we'll get started with that next.